the idea that we are separate from nature and have dominion over it was the starting point.
Yeah.
Because we're not. We're completely a part of nature, and nature's a part of us. And it was somehow that weird worldview of separation that started us on this road. When I used to teach my principles of sustainability class right at the very start, I'd say that, you know, what you're going to realize in this class is that sustainability is all about right relationship. Right relationship with ourselves through our reflective practice, with our communities through real community engagement, and with our Mother Earth that we are a part of. We are not separate from it. And that one of the tragedies of our culture is that relationships been very much shattered. We don't have those deep relationships that we used to have as a human community for hundreds of thousands of years.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
a very, very recent, rapid change, and you never hear about it, but we've lost a lot in terms of relationship. The good news is that in all complex systems, all meaningful change always bubbles up from the bottom. Yeah. So that's where I've found to focus my attention, is at the community level.
Well, Tom, I am delighted that you are able to participate in this series, because my wife, Connie Barlow, who's a science writer and a naturalist, and we first encountered your work probably about 4 or 5 years ago, The Myth of Progress Toward a Sustainable Future, and just loved it. I mean, we thought so highly of it that, as you know, I recorded the audio. I consider it right up there with William Catton's book, Overshoot, in terms of really helping people get the ecological paradigm. So before I go into the kinds of questions that I'm asking everybody in this particular series, which is more along the lines of, you know, their personal story of how they came to an understanding that things are looking challenging, to say the least. I mean, we all grew up, those of us who were born in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, with an understanding or an expectation that things would just keep getting better and better. And the myth of progress, really. And then that shifted for most of us, all of us in this series. So could you help the viewer or the listener sort of get who you are? Say a little bit about your background and what you've been doing professionally.
Okay, well, I'm a terrestrial ecologist. That means I'm focused on work in land-based ecosystems. I guess I'm best known for my work in forest ecosystems, but I have a strong interest in desert, alpine, Arctic ecosystems. I tend to be, as an academic, because I am now a professor emeritus in a graduate school, I tend to be a generalist, which is unusual. But I find it to be very helpful because it allows me to be pretty transdisciplinary. So I not only have interest in ecology, but a strong interest in geology, complex systems theory, the interface of nature and culture, and I guess the way all these different things mix.
Yeah, yeah. Well, related to this theme of a post-doom conversation, conversations exploring overshoot, grief, gratitude, and grounding. First of all, just in terms of the language, what do you think of when you hear the term post-doom, and what language do you use?
It sounds apocalyptic, but I guess in my case, I never felt doom. I have felt sadness. I think probably back around the 1990s, I began to realize that it wasn't that humans were bad. It was our current system that was terribly flawed. And I knew that it had to change for the future well-being of this planet and the people that live on this planet, that it had to change. My hope was that we would wake up, realize that, you know, our paradigm was off, our worldview was off. I don't know why in Western culture we went this route of really focusing on things like power and dominance and competition and, you know, the right of the individual instead of the right of the communal. But it's terribly flawed. So I had hoped that we would find a way to wake up and change this thing from the bottom up. It would have to be coming from the bottom up, not the top down, because in a complex system, the top tries to maintain the status of the system. And then it began to dawn on me, probably sometime in the last, I don't know, 10 years, that time was running out on us to really do this. There's still, I think, a slight chance that we could turn this around. But I don't have a lot of hope for that right now. I still have hope that because in a complex system, you can never predict how things are going to play out, and something may come about that really is a catalyst for change. But that said, I don't have doom, because I feel this system has to go away one way or another. And it has. It's already caused a lot of suffering to humanity. And so I'm saddened. I don't feel doom, because also another reason I don't feel doom in working with complex systems, you learn to do a lot of scaling, to scale up to larger spatial or temporal levels, because when you do that, you really see the context of a situation. And by doing that, I know that in the long run, humanity is going to be fine. We're not going to extinguish ourselves. We're a very, very resilient species. And the biosphere will be fine. It's resilient as well. It will come back. But the system has to go one way or another.
Yeah, I'm not as confident as you that there's no way that we could go extinct. It seems to me, whether it's in 50 years or 5 million years, we're going to go extinct.
Well, I think we'll make it through this. Like you said, it's a bottleneck.
Right.
We'll probably see big reductions in population and stuff, but I'm confident we'll make it through, and we will re-find our way. We'll go back to the way we existed for tens and tens of thousands of years.
Yeah, William Catton speaks about Homo colossus, distinguishing Homo colossus and Homo sapiens. Homo colossus is where each of us uses 20 to 50 times the resources and exudes 20 to 50 times the waste. And it seems to me Homo colossus is absolutely destined for extinction and necessary. But that doesn't necessarily mean the extinction of Homo sapiens.
Right.
But again, even that, I have come to peace with the possibility of the extinction of Homo sapiens, only because then it has no power over me. I'm not terrified by that, and so I'm engaged to do as much as I can on behalf of life. My wife Connie is a main point person in North America in terms of assisting trees and migrating north. So doing whatever we can to plant soil, move trees, help our communities live more ecologically, and sort of not be attached to the results, because there's chaos on the horizon. There's challenging times.
Yeah. And again, when scaling up, we see that most species, exist for about 3 million years. Species have a lifespan just the way we do. So eventually humans will cease to exist anyways.
Yes,
down the road.
Exactly. I'd love to ask you some questions about your book, The Myth of Progress, and then some of your other writings, and then we'll jump into those other questions. Because your 5 chapters in The Myth of Progress are so helpful, and doesn't take long to read, and they're 5 chapters: the myth of control, the myth of growth, the myth of energy, the myth of the free market, and the myth of progress. And I'm just wondering if you could just take a couple minutes and just describe just a little bit what you're saying there. The first chapter, the myth of control, complex versus linear systems.
Sure. So, our culture is very much immersed in a linear paradigm that was really brought about by René Descartes back in the 1600s. And it's been powerful, but it is limited when you're dealing with a complex system. And pretty much everything we deal with, except machines, are complex systems. So in complex systems, in linear systems, there is a sense that if you know the parts, you know the system, you can control it. That's why a lot of our interventions in things, when I think of our foreign policy and stuff, is misguided, is we try to fix particular little things without understanding the system. And that often gets us into trouble. So that's the myth of control, is that we can control things when in a complex system, we really can't. There's feedback loops, there's bifurcation events, things we can't anticipate. And we can actually end up creating more havoc or problems by not understanding that. So that's what that chapter is about, really getting into complex systems theory and showing out how control is really a myth. What we really need to do is see systems in a much more larger holistic way, understand what's going on with them, and then see if there are points of intervention where we can work with the system, but it's not tweaking it with just changing a part here or there. It's really looking at the whole dynamic.
Yeah, and the fundamental complex system, of course, is the biosphere, the ecosphere. It's ecology.
Sure.
Yeah.
And as are all of our human systems are all complex.
Yes, exactly.
And what's beautiful about complex system science is once you understand the principles, you can be completely transdisciplinary, but the same principles apply in any system. So as an ecologist in the Myth of Progress, I'm really critiquing our current socioeconomic system. I have no background as an economist, but I feel completely comfortable doing it because I can just look at the basic principles and see how the way we've structured it, we're not following these critical principles.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So chapter 2, the myth of growth, limits and sustainability.
Yeah, so we don't have any examples of systems that continuously grow. All systems are nested within other systems. So like our cells are nested in our bodies, we're nested in the biosphere. And because of that nestedness, if any one system just keeps growing, it's going to start degrading the larger system it's within, and you'll get a feedback loop from that larger system that kicks in and will eventually curtail that growth. It's not a question of whether it will happen, just how or when it will happen. So this notion that the only way we can progress is through economic growth is really misguided, especially if that growth is based on ever-increasing use of energy and material resources, because all we do is just end up degrading the biosphere to a greater degree, and then the feedback eventually will kick in and just stop that growth.
Yeah, amen. Chapter 3, the myth of energy, the second law of thermodynamics.
Yeah, really important, because the second law states that although we can't create or destroy energy, we can transform it from one state to another. But whenever we do that, during the transformation, some energy is lost from the system where that transformation occurs. So for any open systems like our bodies that can take in energy or give off energy, or the biosphere, which can take in energy and bleed off energy, they can be in one of three states. If they take in more energy, then they're bleeding off in the transformations, they are an anti-entropic system. That's a system that grows, and if it self-organizes, becomes more complex through time. When systems reach maturity, they become dynamic equilibrium systems. That means the amount of energy coming in is equal to what's being bled off from its transformation. So that's what we are as adults. We take in about 2,000 food calories a day and give off 2,000 calories of heat a day. But it's a third state that I focus on in that book, and that's a state where a system is bleeding off more energy from its transformations than it's taking in. And that's a state where the system becomes entropic. And many people say, well, as a system becomes entropic, it moves from a state of order to disorder. I don't like those because they're very subjective.
Right.
You could look at a cornfield, looks very orderly, but it's actually a pretty entropic system compared to an ecosystem. So a much better way to measure entropy is that entropic systems, as they bleed off energy, move from a state of complexity to a state of simplicity, and a state of concentration of energy and materials to a state of diffusion. So a good example of this would be a tree getting uprooted in the forest. It dies. It's an entropic system. As decomposers start extracting energy out of that tree, its complex structure starts breaking down. Its complex molecules like cellulose and lignin get broken down to simple molecules like carbon dioxide and water. And after a number of decades, that tree is completely gone, reduced down to very, very simple molecules that have diffused in the air or into the soil. So the reason I bring this up, the biosphere has been around for 3.8 billion years. It's really hard for people to wrap their head around that amount of time. So I use an analogy. I ask people to think of a sheet of paper, the thickness representing a century, and ask, well, how high a stack would we need, each sheet representing a century, to represent 3.8 billion years? And the stack would be over 3 miles in height. It's staggering. But throughout its tenure, the biosphere has been, for the first basically 3.5 billion years, an anti-entropic system. It took in more energy from solar gain through photosynthesis than was releasing as heat from the metabolism of all the biota. And that built up our 21% oxygen atmosphere. It built up a lot of biomass on the planet, including all these fossil fuels and coal and oil and things that were sequestered away. And then about 300 million years ago, the biosphere became a mature system and was at dynamic equilibrium. But for the first time in its history, it's now an entropic system. And it's solely because of our actions, where we are basically transforming such high rates of energy that we're surpassing the amount of energy coming in and being fixed within the biosphere. So the biosphere is becoming simplified, energy and materials being diffused.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great overview. Thank you. So chapter 4 is the myth of the free market, the loss of diversity and democracy.
Yeah, that chapter really focuses on the complex science principle of self-organization, that self-organizing systems, as they develop, get more complex, and the complexities derive from the parts becoming ever more specialized but tightly integrated together, such that each part doing what it needs to do to sustain itself creates conditions that sustain the whole. And as a result, these self-organizing systems grow increasingly resilient and stable. Another way to look at this is that if we go out, let's say in the natural world, coevolution is the self-organizing process out there through evolutionary time. And through time, it's creating species that become more and more and more specialized. That means that an ecosystem can support more and more species through time, and it builds up a lot of repetition of function and critical functional roles. Like if we go out like in the woods around here, we're not going to find just a handful of decomposing organisms. We've got thousands of them. Yeah. You're not going to find just a handful of pollinators. We've got 1,000 or more of them. We don't have just a handful of photosynthetic plants. We've got hundreds and hundreds of them. So self-organization decentralizes critical functional roles. Whenever we move in the opposite way of concentrating or centralizing critical roles, the system moves towards instability and lack of resiliency. And that's pretty much what our free market system has done. It's moved away from having lots and lots of small, specialized business enterprises. And now it doesn't matter what sector you look at, whether it's pharmaceuticals or energy or media or retail, agriculture, the bulk of the capital is running through a very few number of very, very large corporate entities. And people don't realize that really makes the system not resilient and very fragile. Yes, so exactly. A good example of this would have been the financial meltdown of 2008. Many people pin that on risky investments. Well, they were the catalyst, but the underlying reason was that 54% of all the banking assets in this country are held by just 10 banks, an incredible concentration of capital in very few hands. And with so many banks that failed during that period and then got taken over by the large banks, we're even less diversified now. Something like 82% of all the capital is held by 10 banks. So I don't know what will do it, but there'll probably be another catalyst. And the next time it's going to be a much bigger problem because the system has no resiliency.
Yeah.
So that's what that is looking at.
Yeah, that's great. And I also understand that you significantly sort of beefed up or worked on that chapter in your revision from 2006 because of the meltdown.
Yeah. I wanted to get more into aspects of climate change, which are one outcome, and also wanted to get really into showing how if we just follow the way nature works, nature is a perfect model of a sustainable system. It's not only sustained itself, it's thrived.
Yes.
And it's done it by creating more and more specialized entities, tightly integrated together, creating this very resilient system. That's what we need to sort of go back to because the current system is terribly flawed.
Yeah, what gives me hope is the realization that whatever remnant of humanity survives this coming bottleneck, should any of us survive, which I think there's a pretty decent chance, they'll have to live this way. They'll have to model nature because nature is not just an it. Nature is a thou. So they'll mythologize that, as all sustainable cultures have.
Right.
So chapter 5, the myth of progress, the need for cultural change.
Yeah, I think that chapter is really just saying that, and I mentioned this earlier, that we always look at what we've gained with this sort of system, which is, yes, we've gained material wealth and we've gained comfort, but the question is at what expense? And that's where I really get into the loss of relationship. And recount, I think I start that chapter by recounting an experience of coming across this ancient, he said, Adam trail down in northern Mexico, that these are the oldest footpaths in the Americas. We know they're at least 12,000 years old, but some climatologists are stating by looking at desert varnish on rocks that are embedded in these trails that they're probably 35,000 years old, but they're ancient. Mm-hmm. And so I started walking on this trail, and it just struck me, well, my God, what was life actually like for these people? Because this is a really austere, tough place. And I realized that, yeah, life was probably physically challenging, being in a really arid desert environment like that. But then I thought it's probably was actually emotionally quite rich, because
Yes.
they had vibrant relationships within their clan community. They had a vibrant relationship with Mother Earth. They had stories and myths that made that linkage even stronger, and they had plenty of reflective time for their own practices. And so life could have been physically hard, but might have been experientially rich. And I think we're the flip side of that. In our culture, we have become physically comfortable, but experientially and relationally poor. So that's what that chapter is about.
Yeah, and the physical comfort is, of course, temporary. This is when you get overshoot, when you get carrying capacity, when you get that you can't have things getting better and better for some humans, and that process is degrading everything humans depend upon. You know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to, or even an ecologist to see that that's not sustainable.
No, it's not.
Yeah. In fact, I created about a year ago a sort of, it's been dubbed a Pinker takedown video. I didn't call it that. I called it Sane versus Insane Progress. But it's just 24 minutes long. It's up on YouTube, but it's basically showing how those people who focus, like Steven Pinker does, and other prophets of progress, talk about how things are getting better and better for many human beings, often technologically and otherwise, without in any way giving attention to how it's precisely economic growth and development and technological progress and complexity that is also causing the precipitous decline, like a free fall of every single system that we depend on.
Yeah. Well, here's that linear thinking again, which basically states, well, it's worked in the past, so it'll continue to work in the present.
Right.
Completely ignores feedback loops. And every single environmental problem we're witnessing today, it's all from a technology.
Yes.
I mean, so technology is a useful tool and we can use it appropriately, but we have to be very wise about our technologies, and just thinking that, oh yeah, we'll just continue to progress because technology will solve these problems. That's crazy, because all the problems we're facing are the result of technologies.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think Joanna Macy once said something in an interview I remember seeing where, we think technologies will solve our problem. Technologies are what caused the problem, which is just pretty much exactly what you're saying.
It's a tool we can use, but the problem has to be solved by us behaving in a totally different way.
Yeah, I think as long as we measure progress and measure well-being in terms of how individuals and groups of individuals are doing, sort of anthropocentric measures of progress and well-being, we are going to self-destruct. It's only if we measure progress and well-being by how well the soil is doing decade by decade, how well the forests are doing decade by decade.
And we should mention that, yes, for a select group, it's really worked well, but there's a lot of people who have been completely disenfranchised by this whole situation. There's a lot of human suffering out there that's been created by this globally, so that it's really a minority of people that have really benefited.
Yeah, and even that's a shrinking class.
Yeah.
Well, say a little bit about some of your other books are just so highly rated on Amazon. You're really well known for reading the forested landscape, forest forensics. So say just a little bit about your other books as well.
So those two books are very much related to showing people how they can go into a forest and literally read its history by picking up the evidence that's been left by past disturbances. So, around here in New England, about 80% of our forests were once open agricultural land. So you can infer whether it was crop field or pasture or hay field. You can infer when it was abandoned to grow back to forest. You can interpret storm events, whether hurricanes or thunderstorms. You can date these things. You can figure out how many times a forest has been logged, when those occurred, if it's been subjected to fire. All that stuff leaves evidence that, if you know how to interpret it, can bring about very detailed histories of the forest. And the reason I like it is that many people see nature as an Edenic blur, which is wonderful. But I think if you want to have intimacy, you have to know the story behind something. Yes. So if you have intimacy with a person, you have to know what's formed them, what has made them who they are. It's the same with an ecosystem. It has its own history. And when you learn to read it, it develops a much more intimate relationship with that place. So that's, I think, why I like doing this.
Well, I'm so grateful that you said it exactly like that, because as an eco-theologian, to my mind, relationship or out of relationship is the fundamental issue between sustainable and unsustainable. And that it really is the ecologists who can begin to help us once again have an intimate, personal, what I call I thou, that is a humble and respectful relationship to really that which is our source, our sustenance, and our end, our material source, sustenance, and end. And I see unsustainable cultures as those that have a concept of the divine that's not living, that doesn't include the living world, then those merely otherworldly or transcended. And that indigenous or first peoples or cultures that still were able to, and still are able to, in those pockets where they exist, live in a way that doesn't diminish and degrade primary reality, in a way that honors the living world as a greater thou, not a lesser it, do so precisely because they have relationship. Their language is relational. They have a personal relationship. And so that's one of the things that I love so much about your book, The Myth of Progress, is that you come back to that again and again throughout the course of the book.
Yeah, it's critical. When I used to teach my principles of sustainability class right at the very start, I'd say that, you know, what you realize in this class is that sustainability is all about right relationship. Right relationship with ourselves through our reflective practice, with our communities through real community engagement, and with our Mother Earth that we are a part of. We are not separate from it. And that one of the tragedies of our culture is that relationships been very much shattered. We don't have those deep relationships that we used to have as a human community for hundreds of thousands of years.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
a very, very recent, rapid change, and you never hear about it, but we've lost a lot in terms of relationship.
Oh, I completely agree. I think that's the fundamental difference is anthropocentrism, human-centeredness, which we've only had for several thousand years, and ecocentrism or life-centeredness, which is the only thing that's sustainable, and that's the first 97% roughly of human history.
Yeah, that is our heritage.
So, Tom, say a little bit more about how you came, like sort of a little bit of your life story in terms of how you viewed things in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. You touched on this, you began touching this already, and then how that began shifting the more you got into an ecological worldview and really understood decline.
All right, I guess I would have to start with my freshman year in college in 1969. I don't think I even had self-awareness that I was a person. I was good in math and science. My dad was an engineer. He said, "You'll be great. Go to Johns Hopkins University and study industrial engineering," which seems odd for me nowadays. But it was good because I got there and I was completely disenchanted with what was going on. I thought, this is not what I want to do. And I was also not good about being in a city, being in Baltimore. I missed being in a rural area. And luckily I had a pretty enlightened dorm head who said, you know, you got to get your head out of these engineering books. And he gave me 3 books. The first one he gave me was Elk Speaks, which was just mind-blowing for me. You know, my whole idea of Indians is what I had learned watching television in the 1950s, you know, that the cowboys are the good guys, the Indians are the bad guys, that no knowledge of the genocide or the horrors that happened. And to read that book and then see this man who was so deeply spiritual. I mean, the very beginning of that book, The Offering of the Pipe, the first 5 pages, I think, are the most amazing prose I've ever read, because right away it's just showing how inherently connected to Mother Earth we are and how sacred it is and how important that relationship is. Then I was given Sane County Almanac by this dorm head. And now I'm reading Leopold and seeing the same thing, but in a European-based heritage person that's talking about this connection to land. And then I got Silent Spring. And that trio completely blew my mind. I read them all within that November of that semester. And I just knew that I had to do something that was going to resonate with my connection to the woods, which I always had a very strong connection to, so I completely changed my career path for the better, no doubt. In the 70s, it was a very heady time. I thought, okay, we're really making strides here. I mean, you couldn't get elected to office. I don't care if you were Republican, Democrat, you couldn't get elected to office if the environment wasn't right up there in the number 2 or 3 on your priority list. So I guess it was by the 1990s when I realized, boy, this environmental movement has really lost traction. And part of that was a linear approach to things and trying to see people as almost separate from the environment, like we were bad, the environment is good, when it wasn't people, it was our systems. And I realized, okay, the real problem here is not us as people, it's the systems that we use, it's our worldview that we've accepted. And that's when I thought, okay, I'm gonna start teaching this. So that's when I started teaching the principles of sustainability class. That was back early, mid-90s, which gave rise to the book, The Myth of Progress. But I'm guessing that probably as I got into, I don't know, 2010, something like that, I thought, we have time, but we don't have a lot of time. And, we're not making major strides at a systemic level. We do have a lot of good things happening, but larger scale change was not happening at the rate I was hoping. So that's when I began to realize, okay, this is not how I had envisioned it. There was sadness, but at the same time a realization, well, if that's the way it happens, that's the way it happens. But at least the system will change and there'll be a new open horizon for the biosphere and for humanity.
Yeah, and what you just articulated in the last 30 seconds is what I'm meaning by post-doom. Not that you've necessarily felt it in a way that you would describe as doom, but the sadness, the grief, the heartbreak of having worked for change in a positive direction, worked for change along ecological lines, having some hope that it would be successful at some scale, and then at some point realizing, something, I don't think we're going to be successful, certainly not in the ways or at the scale that I would have liked. And then the emotional hit that often comes. And then ultimately moving through whatever stages of grief or whatever, anger or bargaining or depression or, whatever, just the sadness to a place of engaged action, doing what you can, where you can make a difference, and trusting what you can't make a difference.
Yeah. No, I think that's very true. And for me, I guess around that time, I gave up optimism or pessimism. I didn't see them as useful anymore.
Yeah.
If you're optimistic, you're not going to do much to promote important change. If you're pessimistic, you then are paralyzed. But I have hope. I still have hope. There's always the possibility that something could happen. The further down this timeline we go, the possibility gets smaller and smaller and smaller, but it's not out of the picture yet. And so, yeah, that I have hope, and I have not let it, affect me emotionally. I just do what I can do, and a lot of that is just community building at the local scale, and that's valuable. So
yeah, amen. Well, I don't see hope personally. I don't see hope as neutral. Hope to me is like liquid. Some liquids will kill you, some liquids will sustain you. There are some forms of hope or things that we can hope for or in that actually continue to empower us or inspire us to live in an anti-future way, in a non-ecological, consumptive, destructive way. And there are some hopes that we can have or put our faith in that actually inspire us to downshift our lifestyles and live more ecologically. So the word hope itself is a little problematic in my world. It depends on what you're hoping in or hoping for. But inspiration, I think there's plenty of inspiration for us to realize how profoundly related and interconnected we are with all of life, with all beings, and to realize that even extinction isn't the last word, that regeneration is sort of the way of life, and that we can participate in that.
We've had, 5 major extinction events that we have evidence of, and something like up to 90% of the species in the globe wiped out. But it only took nature about 15 million years to not only rebuild all that biotic diversity, but it succeeded it each time. So I'm confident that this is a little blip, and it's going to be much smaller, I think, than the other ones. But it'll be a big impact on probably human civilization.
Oh, surely. Well, Tom, you mentioned Black Elk, Aldo Leopold, Rachel Carson. Any other authors or significant influences on you or resources that you would recommend to folk?
Oh boy, there's quite a few. I'll probably leave a number out, but I'd say Capra's book, The Web of Life, is a really critical book. That was one that I used a lot in my teaching and sort of influenced the method progress. Um, the writing is cumbersome, so but there's worthwhile information there. And then I think some of our more recent, I'd say, spiritual teachers, people like Terry Tempest Williams, I find very informative. One of my good friends, Lorette Savoy, came out with a book called Trace, which I think is a really important narrative of memory, place, and people, and finding your way through troubled times and stuff. So those are works that just immediately come to mind.
Well, I'm curious, related to sort of the story, the past as well as the future, have you had thoughts around, well, if we only had done this by this time, or if we only sort of if only, like where did humanity sort of, take a wrong turn or take a non-ecological turn or whatever? Or do you have more of a sense of sort of inevitability that this is what symbolic speech using tool making animals would do in almost any,
I don't think it's inevitable, because I think we had, like you said, indigenous cultures that could live in ways with this planet and with this earth that was not like what we're doing. So I think it's our worldview. I think somehow the idea that we are separate from nature and have dominion over it was the starting point.
Yeah.
Because we're not. We're completely a part of nature, and nature's a part of us. And it was somehow that weird worldview of separation that started us on this road. And maybe once we got on that track, it was inevitable. Because if you have that worldview, then nature just becomes a commodity. And then if you develop technologies, you're going to drive down that path. So.
Yeah, well, I think language undergirds that once we call primary reality nature, once we refer to primary reality merely as the environment, that almost forces us or makes it effortless for us to see ourselves as above and dominating and that sort of thing. Whereas we probably wouldn't have deceived ourselves if the word God hadn't become trivialized as merely otherworldly rather than sort of a proper name for the ecosphere also. In addition to yourself, two of the people along ecological lines that have had the biggest impact on me, I mentioned William Catton and his book Overshoot, but also Edward Goldsmith, who was the founder and the editor of the Ecologist magazine for close to 40 years, and his book The Way, An Ecological Worldview. Have you read either of those? Or?
Yes, I have. Yeah, I have high regard for those two people and their work as well.
Yeah, that's great. Impermanence and death. One of the things that I'm asking everybody, all the participants in this series, is how they view impermanence and death. And I mean, Connie and I, for example, have for close to a decade, we did programs on sort of a sacred science approach, a meaningful, inspiring look, science-based, about the role of death and impermanence in the universe. And you can't have a universe without death and impermanence. And so that's nourished us. But I'm just curious, how has an understanding of impermanence and death as natural, as necessary, as no less sacred than life, has that informed you, or is that not something you think a lot about?
No, it's very much informed me, because it's part of this cycle that, I mean, you can't have in, let's say, the natural world or anything I can think of, something existing forever. It would just, the whole system would break down and fall apart. You need to have new individuals, new players coming in and others exiting. And you have to have all those nutrients recycling through. And the only way to get them recycling is if there are things like death and impermanence. So no, it seems completely natural. And it's, I think that we focus so much on life, and we should actually be, I think, more focused just on death, that this is an inevitability. so that we're prepared for it. I think that probably, again, indigenous people had a much more accurate view of these sorts of things, and death wasn't shunned. It was just a part of the whole mystery of existence, and rightly so. For us, we package it and we hide it.
Right.
When no, it's just a normal, important process that's a part of this thing.
Yeah, that's great. I agree completely. So, in terms of gifts, in coming to terms with the cascading problems of overshoot, resource depletion, climate breakdown, and so on, have you found a place beyond sort of mere acceptance, sort of the stages of grief leading to acceptance, and what's opened up for you on the other side?
Well, I think it's something that was always there, but I've just turned to it a lot more. And that is that, my relationship with the natural world, it is really important to me. I can go out in the woods and I can be very analytical reading a history, but I also, when we lived in Vermont, had developed a 1 mile trail loop through our woodland there that I kept clear of sticks and everything. I could actually walk that trail with my eyes closed, because if I started drifting off, I would start crunching sticks. So, but it was a very reflective practice, and I just find that, it's just really, really enriching. So that is, I think, my gift is nature, and just communing with it, and just realizing that this is way bigger than I am. It's been around a long time. It's gonna be around here a long time more. I'm a part of it, a passing part, but it's just so enriching.
Yeah. Wow. Well, the way you just articulated that reminded me of sort of a way of characterizing the difference between pro-future cultures and anti-future cultures. It seems to me that pro-future cultures, there's a humility embedded within the worldview, one of we belong to the land.
Mm-hmm.
And in anti-future cultures, there's a hubris built into the worldview. The land belongs to us.
Oh yeah.
And that's huge. And it sounds like your version of Darwin's sandpath walk is precisely a practice. That was one of the other things I wanted to ask you. Are there other spiritual / ecological practices that help keep your mind and heart in a grounded place?
Yeah, I think that's it. I can talk about this now. I didn't used to talk about it. My mom passed away a few years ago, but when I was 4, she developed mental illness, and I was at home alone with her. My older siblings were in school. My dad traveled a lot, and it was pretty scary. And she actually taught me how to call her psychiatrist if she needed it. When my siblings would leave for school, there was a stool by our wall-mounted telephone. She'd have me climb up on it, and she'd keep the plunger down, but she had me dial the number and then just say, "This is Tommy Wessels. My mommy needs your help." So one day she was in her room, hysterical and crying and screaming, and I could hear her saying, "Call the doctor, Tommy, call." So I did. But of course, a 4-year-old, I thought they'd be there right away. It took them 20 minutes, and I freaked out and went across the street into these woods that were across the street from our house. I was down there for hours, and it became something I just did. I felt very comfortable as a 4-year-old being off in there on my own. I never got lost. I sort of had a visual map in my head of where I was in the forest. I know my mom knew I was down there, and she didn't stop me because I think she thought I was probably safer down there than with her. But that really became my connection to the natural world. That was my sanctuary. That was actually, my replacement mother when my mother couldn't be a mother. So that's deeply embedded in me, and it's deeply embedded in my practice. And yeah.
Thank you for sharing that story. So Tom, last question, remaining opportunities. What is your take on what is beyond our control now, and where we still can make a difference individually and collectively? In other words, what's your sense of what's no longer possible, but what still is possible?
Yeah. I don't know if anything is completely off the list as being possible. I think it'd be super, super challenging for some things at this point. But one thing I think that really is possible is working in communities. Any change that we're going to do, it's going to come from the bottom up. And at least communities can start creating relationships in communities between people so they can be there to be supportive to each other. They can create networks. And these communities can then be sort of the hubs of maybe what comes later, at least the models that come later. But there's a lot we can do at the community level. And luckily, even at the state level, it's still possible. There's some states that have done quite a bit. At the federal level, I think, forget it. So maybe that is one of the ones that's off the table. I think, that probably is off the table at this point because it's just complete gridlock. They can't do anything of import. So it has to be done at smaller scales. But the good news is that in all complex systems, all meaningful change always bubbles up from the bottom.
Yeah.
So that's where I've found to focus my attention is at the community level.
Yeah, that's great. So Tom, this has been fabulous. Thank you so much for taking the time. As I mentioned, Connie and I love your work, and you have offered us a grounding in sort of what I call ecological spirituality. For me, spirituality is simply what helps us live in right relationship to reality. So thank you for this.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's important conversations to have.